Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Alongside Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. I'm on location tonight in New York City. Jonathan, conveniently in Seattle. We're going coast to coast on this edition of Protected Speech, and a lot to get into because the midterms hit on Tuesday, and it was an eventful night. Certainly for us at Diya TV, we got to do a 3-hour live election night special with a whole bunch of folks, Indian Americans, South Asians, candidates, bundlers, political operatives, giving us context. But beyond that, the whole nation is still in flux because they're still counting ballots in a number of states, and we'll talk about that dichotomy. Let's get into some of the news that we've covered. Really, the big headline of the week for the Indian American community, at least, is that there's another member of Congress from this community. Shri Thanadar got elected to Congress from Detroit. He's the first, Indian American member of Congress from Michigan, and he's got a unique story. He's an immigrant. He's 67 years old, and he came on Diya TV live with us shortly after he was declared the victor. Very interesting guy. He's an entrepreneur, and he's going to go there and try to shake things up in Washington. And again, one of these stories here where, I frankly, I'm surprised that his story resonated, because it's not like it's a dominant Asian American district. I mean, this has been a historically Black district, but they love his story. It's a compelling figure. He's been in public service, serving in the Michigan legislature, and now he's got an opportunity to head to Congress.
Yeah, and this guy has a track record, right? Like you said, he's already a public servant, an elected official. On top of that, he's a self-made millionaire, as we know. With that said, a stunning statistic coming out. First time in 70 years, Detroit won't have a Black representative in Congress. So again, that is a pretty stunning statistic. But what you don't hear a lot of in mainstream media is the significance of Thanadar's election win. He is, again, one of the few Indian Americans now in Congress, and he has an opportunity to really shake things up, and I think that's why he got voted into office.
Well, I mean, just a few years ago, we had no Indian Americans in Congress, and all of a sudden, from Kamala Harris, who got into the Senate, to Ami Bera, who was the first Indian American to get elected in recent vintage. There was a guy, 50, 60 years ago in California, but there was no one in modern times. But all of a sudden, Ami Bera, Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal, Raja Krishnamurthy, now Shri Thanadar, and of course Kamala Harris is in the White House as vice president. And you never know where the GOP is, but certainly Nikki Haley's been floated as potentially maybe a VP or presidential candidate. So we're seeing both parties, embrace the community. The community starting to run and all these different spots. And we'll talk about some of these other races as well that we were able to showcase. But it's an amazing story, considering there was 0%. And now there's actual real representation with 5 members of the House that are Indian American. So it's a real sea change. It kind of demonstrates that the community is getting engaged. And the nice thing is, even though they're all Democrats, the GOP is also starting to understand that this community is in play. It's a swing vote. And so we're going to see much more effort, paid attention to this community moving forward.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to bring up as well. All the elected officials who are of South Asian descent or Indian American, they're Democrats. So when you say representation, I guess it all depends how you define representation. Representation isn't just one political party. It's a spectrum of viewpoints that includes Republicans as well. But, another storyline here, so much for the red wave, right? There was an expectation that a lot of these important swing states or some of these tight races would end up leaning Republican, and that never happened. And another part of that narrative coming out is that several Trump-endorsed candidates got blown away, including Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, who lost to John Fetterman by a significant margin. And as we know, there's several other races that are still being counted and in play. But Carrie Lake, who's running for governor in Arizona, she's actually trailing right now. She's a huge election denier, a huge Trump supporter to this day. And she is no doubt a sophisticated media, consumer, and also someone who's been in the media. So she understands the game on both sides, right? So I expected her to have a much stronger showing. Again, that race isn't over, but I think it's going to be something close to watch right now, that the House may be in play, that it may be leaning Republican, but the Senate, I think it's still a razor-thin margin there. And, of course, there's the runoff now in Georgia, right, between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock.
I mean, all these races still in play, and again, the balance of power is not entirely shifted. It does look like the GOP will likely squeak out the House, but if it's certainly not going to be the 20 to 40 seats that was initially predicted. I mean, we had folks thinking it was a complete sweep by the GOP, but the Senate. I mean, we've had some predictions that say it might stay status quo, 50-50, but Fetterman, being a Democrat, he actually picked up a seat. Pennsylvania, that seat previously was a Republican seat. So that was a big victory. We actually had Dr. Oz come on via TV. He was trying to court Indian American and Hindu American voters at the last moment. And it is surprising, but at the same time, there was a huge get out the vote effort. And don't forget Fetterman, who has been struggling with his health in recent months. He was really pushed over the finish line by President Obama as well as President Biden. Both of them were there helping to campaign for Fetterman down the stretch. It was a very pivotal seat for the Democrats to hold on to. It's a 50-50 margin right now. They both the Democrats and the Republicans, and Kamala Harris is that tie-breaking vote. But Oz fell short, and it was surprising to the Republicans, who have been kind of fed this narrative, at least maybe through all of these conservative TV networks, that this was going to be a huge sea change coming. And I think that's what's surprising is the polling. We saw the polling in 2016 was inaccurate. The polling in 2020 wasn't particularly great. And certainly in 2022, it doesn't look like they have any information about what's really going on the ground. I mean, we had Brigadier General Don Bolduc from New Hampshire also came on, and people were saying, hey, he's within the margin. He's like he's 1 point off the lead from Maggie Hassan. Hassan blew him out of the water.
And historically, again, the party that's in the White House usually ends up losing a significant number of seats during the midterms. But history in this case didn't repeat itself. So I think we're seeing some interesting trends. Again, you referencing the polls that were a little bit off in terms of what they predicted. At the same time, I thought this was a preview, at least from the Republicans' standpoint, a preview of who some of these presidential candidates could be. Clearly, President Donald Trump, even though he's on the sidelines right now and has not announced that he's officially running for president in 2024, he's still part of this conversation. And again, several candidates who were endorsed by Trump losing, and the Republican establishment that wants to sort of move on from the Trump days, they're blaming Trump, which includes Fox News. But one of the strongest showings clearly out of Florida, I want to play this clip from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who won convincingly in his re-election campaign. Let's listen to him right now.
Woke ideology. We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
A lot to unpack there, but clearly Governor Ron DeSantis considered a leading candidate for the Republican nomination if it comes down to it. So many angles, so many news headlines there, but let's just kind of first unpack what he was talking about. Ravi, you live in San Francisco, I live in Seattle, and just in the past couple of years, if you haven't been living under a rock, clearly this quote-unquote woke movement has been used by Republicans, by many, as an agenda being pushed by the left, the far left, and the progressives and the Democrats. And the Democrats essentially have been blamed in many ways for allowing this woke movement to come in and take over, which has, impacted public school education, the entire conversation about sexual identity, critical race theory. The list goes on and on. What are your thoughts on DeSantis winning so convincingly, but also doubling down on that woke narrative? Is this something you think we're going to see when he potentially announces that he's running for president in 2024?
Well, I mean, this is the big message and the headline from DeSantis's win. It wasn't a small margin. I mean, that's a dominant performance in what was considered a swing state just a few years ago. So he definitely pushed the state to the more to the right.
Is Florida even a swing state anymore? Let's be honest. Is Florida even a swing state at this point?
Absolutely not. It's not just
exactly.
He not just blew things out of the water in 2022. In 2024, the presidential election is not going to be won by a Democrat. The Electoral College is not going to a Democrat in in 2024. I mean, he just moved it further to the right than anyone expected. So he is just very popular. And if again, we've been hearing these stories from Florida. We run a few TV stations down there, and we hear these narratives. And again, don't forget, we just had Hurricane Ian there a few weeks ago. I mean, Fort Myers got destroyed, and he was able to restock fuel very quickly. And there were a lot of folks that were very happy with his performance under pressure. So DeSantis has a lot of goodwill with Floridians. And again, they had a different approach towards COVID, right? This goes down to approach, light touch government with some of the key talking points that Republicans have used historically. We all know that, you talk about cutting down big government. Well, both parties have enabled an enormous government. I mean, our deficit is outlandish and no one wants to get it under control. But this is a message that DeSantis is expressing, which I think is resonating with a lot of folks. Leave me alone. I want to be able to have freedom. And keep in mind, when it comes to children and families, if you really look at the messaging, that's why we were talking to Indian Americans during the election. In fact, we talked to Danny Gaikwad, who's an enormous DeSantis supporter, and basically said, even though he supported Trump in 2020, he was throwing his full support behind DeSantis. He thinks DeSantis is the next guy who should be the GOP nominee. And Gaikwad's been involved in politics for 30 years. He put on a Diwali event at DeSantis's mansion along with the First Lady, and they raised more than $100,000 for Hurricane Ian victims. So he's very influential in Florida, and he gave us some insight about what is resonating. And we had another guy, Rishi Bugga, who ran as a Democrat in Orlando. He barely won the primary, but he won as a first-time candidate. But in the general, he got blown out by a Republican. That red wave. I mean, DeSantis being the top of the ticket certainly helped Marco Rubio and all the other Republican candidates along the line. So, good people like Rishi, we've known Rishi Bugga for many years. He's a nice guy, but, he was certainly impacted by this movement from DeSantis. So this has long-term ramifications because, look, I think this is where the GOP is trying to reframe themselves and say, look, Trump's time has come, but we have another leader here in the offing that is getting widespread support. And don't forget, Florida had a huge influx in population from around the country because they had looser restrictions on life, right? I mean,
my question really is, though, the culture wars, right? Again, he, in Florida at least, ran on this messaging of wokeness comes to die in Florida. And one of the reasons why that's been in play for Governor DeSantis, he's really seen as this right-wing champion and a champion of family values. He took on Disney. Let's not forget, several months ago, a video leaked from Disney, media leaders, which basically showed content creators talking about trying to bring pansexual, non-binary, characters into their cartoons and the Marvel universe and the Disney World, aspect, and that got taken on, and there were protests, and DeSantis essentially came out of that as seen as this kind of fighter, this blue-collar champion willing to take on a massive corporation like Disney because Disney was allegedly trying to, again, undermine family values. Do you think that narrative, that agenda will carry over into more of a national debate right now? Because I want to be very clear. He ran on that in Florida. He's beloved in Florida. He's untouchable there. If he wants to be the governor, I believe, for the next decade, he can easily do that, right? But if he does run for president, do you feel like this anti-woke agenda will resonate with the rest of the country?
Well, I don't think it's one element, right? So that's one aspect where you have a lot of folks who are upset that things seemingly have gone more to the left under the Biden administration, right? There's a lot of changes there. There's a lot of folks that are critical because, Biden himself, I think sometimes it gets lost. Biden, I don't believe, got elected because he was a leftist. He got elected because he was a moderate. People thought, okay, he's been in government.
More stable and safer than Trump.
Correct. He was
the lesser of two evils.
He was like, hey, get things back on track. If you look at the business leaders, right, you had conservative business leaders who said, hey, I don't want to spend 5% of my brain power worrying about what Trump is going to do on Twitter, right? That was a huge concern for a lot of kind of elite business people, many of whom would likely vote for the GOP typically, but Trump really pushed the envelope to the point where people are like, we need to have a little bit more stability in foreign policy as well as, domestic policy. I mean, don't forget, Trump would put out a tweet and, North Korea would be activated, right? It was like, oh, well, I might just take on Kim Jong-un right now. I mean, this is how we were living from day to day for 4 years. It was, for those of us in the news business, for the first 6 months, we were like, is this serious? And then we finally realized, okay, well, unless he takes actions, I'm not going to go crazy over tweets. But, it was a sea change from what we've seen.
Well, I think where Governor DeSantis really comes off as this champion of family values. I can give you an example here in Seattle. A business owner here told me in confidence that, hey, look, he's going to be, pulling his kids out from Seattle public schools. And I said, well, why? He goes, well, I'm going to send them now to Catholic school. I'm like, wait, you're not even Catholic. He goes, yeah, I know. But at least in Catholic school, I know they're going to get normal family values and a regular education. And what he was alluding to is that in some of these liberal, coastal cities like a Seattle, the public school education, parents are claiming that essentially the whole BLM, transgender, woke agenda, CRT, critical race theory is being shoved down the throats of their kids without any parents being able to have a say or be consulted. So again, I think that's where Governor DeSantis comes in and says, hey, I want to give parents a choice. I want to give parents a voice. And I don't know, though, if that's going to resonate at the time in 2024 with the rest of the nation. But it is real interesting, again, that he doubled down. He ran on that. And that clip that we played earlier, again, where Governor DeSantis is heard saying woke comes to die in Florida, that's significant.
No question. I mean, I certainly think he is lining up his messaging for a run at the presidency. And the real question is, we've talked about Trump. Is he going to run? I interviewed him in September. He is going to run. I mean, he has all these legal challenges. In many respects, a lot of
he's already attacking DeSantis.
Right. I mean, look at it from the standpoint of Trump. He has all these legal battles that are still ongoing. If he doesn't run, he's a sitting duck, right? He gets pounded away by the legal process in New York and DC, wherever he can be attacked. Right now, if he's on offense, if he's doing rallies, if he's got 70 million Americans, which, voted for him in 2020, if he goes to these political rallies, starts building the base in these swing states, goes around town, he can create that momentum and keep some of the heat off of him. Meanwhile, he's a business guy. Who's to say that?
Show some of these headlines as you keep going, but I want to make sure that we can see some of these headlines right now that emerge from Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. These Rupert Murdoch owned and operated media conglomerates here. Look at that. The New York Post, owned by Rupert Murdoch, a right-wing paper in New York City, and already they're blaming Trump. What do you make of this? That even some of the traditional right-wing media like Fox News and New York Post and Wall Street Journal are turning on Trump right now.
Well, I think I've alluded to this perhaps on this show before, but I've had private conversations with folks involved with the GOP at a very high level, and they tell me, look, we have another potential way to go at this, a plan B, so to speak, and DeSantis is the name. And, certainly in terms of running mate, I've been told Nikki Haley would potentially be his running mate. But, like what I was just saying, Trump is a deal maker. He's a businessman. So who's to say that
he's now a liability, right? So which one is he?
But look at it this way. Trump has an enormous base of support. Whether you like him or not, the guy has fans. He's been on television. He resonates with a lot of people. Again, people are don't forget, some people in this country like a strong man, right? And that's true of many countries, right? You want a strong leader, and Trump has not backed down from a fight. I mean, if you look at it, some of his policies were haywire, but you're looking at like an Indian American perspective, for example, his policies towards China, much more aggressive than previous presidents, all of them in our lifetimes. His policy towards India resonates with both the left and the right. And so you look at some of that foreign policy, the fact that we didn't get into all these outstanding wars. I mean, keep in mind, right now, the United States is helping Ukraine against Russia. When Trump says he could have probably talked to Putin and kept Russia out of Ukraine, I mean, he has a point there, right? He had a relationship with Putin that's a little bit different than other political leaders. So I think
that was a knock against Biden, right? He didn't show strength, and that's what Trump ran on and exhibited, or tried to, at least in the White House, right? And he always said, if you show these bullies, these communists, strength, they wouldn't dare ever try to invade. So I think it's an interesting point and observation.
Well, again, I think he's going to come back with a counter argument saying, look what I would have done if I had won this 2020 election. And I believe what's going to end up happening, I mean, we'll see if he and DeSantis can work something out. But I think the natural thing is either DeSantis is the running mate, or if Kari Lake gets over the hump in Arizona, which, by the way, her numbers have come up. I mean, she was getting blown out on Tuesday night, in the days afterwards, her numbers for polling is looking better. So we don't even know the outcome of Arizona. We might not know till a few more days from now. But Carrie Lake has been also tossed around as a potential running mate for Trump, and she's a real loyalist with Trump, and she's very charismatic. And you and I both work on television for a living. We know what a good television personality is, and she is that. I mean, whether you believe her talking points or not, she is very good with a camera, and so that could be a very really.
And what she's done
balance.
is essentially expose the liberal bias in the mainstream media, because she was in the mainstream media, and that's one of her strongest assets. As I was referring to earlier, she's not only a media consumer, she was in it, and she understands how the media works and how the media can choose to cover something or not, or spin something. So I think that's extremely, again, it's one of those assets that any politician who understands the media can really, will have an easier time navigating and also calling out the media. And that's what I want to potentially see, because she said she will be the media's worst nightmare if she gets elected.
I mean, she deconstructed the media on multiple accounts. I saw some of these videos. I mean, she took them to task. And frankly speaking, oftentimes she was right on the money with the way the coverage was, because some of the stuff was conflated, and she just took them to task. And, but that is the nature of the game, right? When you're a political candidate, and it's true, Biden's getting abuse right now. Trump gets all kinds of grief. This is what the media does, and you put yourself out there in the spotlight, and this is what comes. But she did deconstruct these media folks and blast them to their face. And I by the way, I think Americans like that. Americans like a fighter.
Exactly.
And that's why Trump.
And they don't want the status quo in many places. So what are you going to do? Hey, let's talk about Stephen Miller, another former Trump guy, right?
Well,
this is one of your stories you've been following.
Well, yeah. I mean, what's interesting about this is that I didn't even know this was a story until I actually looked at my own mailbox, and I got this flyer from Stephen Miller, and it's an organization that Miller runs. It's called America First Legal, and I did not know anything about America First Legal. We're pulling up these flyers that are going out, and what's interesting is that this particular flyer that we have up right now was targeted towards white Americans and Asian Americans, and blaming Biden for discrimination against white people and discrimination against Asian Americans. And
just to remind our viewers, Stephen Miller, former political advisor in the Trump administration, now doing his own thing.
Right. And what's stunning is, again, I live in Silicon Valley, so it's a majority Asian American district. So to get this I have the physical flyer, to get this from Stephen Miller was stunning. Honestly, I looked at it and I was like, what in the world is this?
Right. And it's not just the flyer. The guy, his group is running ads saying white people now are facing racism. They're dealing with reverse racism right now. And the criticism against them is that Asians now, of course, a certain class of Asians are now being lumped in with white people. And that's what Miller's trying to play right now, right? That the whites and the Asians who have allegedly made it, the Asians who are now suing Harvard for, discrimination because they can't get in because of merit. Stephen Miller is trying to use both groups now against everyone else. I find that fascinating play.
Well, that's what's interesting, is that Miller was running ads featuring white people in states like Georgia. And then he has this targeted mailer, towards Asian Americans in Silicon Valley. I'm, again, very sophisticated campaign. I got to at least tip my hat to the fact that he knows the difference. That it's
I'm not saying I necessarily like the advertising, but that's not the point, right? The point is he gets it.
It's really
audience. He sees an opportunity to, touch a third rail, and this is what so many Asian Americans are talking about privately, but don't know how to say publicly, right? Feeling marginalized, right?
It is really nuanced. It is really sophisticated. I'm actually very surprised. And it shows the sophistication through which these political operations, they know things down to the neighborhood level, right? They know. Okay.
And they also know Asian Americans have money. They're highly educated, and they want them. They know, and what they're trying to say is that Asian Americans, which includes Koreans, Chinese, Japanese descent, Thai, Vietnamese, let's throw Indian Americans, Pakistanis, whatever. Stephen Miller and the Republicans know that this is the fastest growing minority voting bloc in America, and they happen to be now highly educated, deep pockets, and they don't have a home necessarily. Asian Americans have traditionally voted Democrat, but Stephen Miller sees an opportunity. What he's playing on is Asian American interests are now at stake. Asian American interests are being threatened. He's playing off of the fear card. Interesting, huh?
Well, again, Miller, what's interesting about this whole move now is that he was a huge architect of Trump's immigration policy, right? I mean, remember the Muslim ban? That was Stephen Miller. That was Stephen Miller.
And he was behind the messaging because the guy was also a speechwriter.
Right.
I mean, he intentionally tried to use the language, own the language. He understood the media as well, and he pushed certain agendas and used certain languages. And that Muslim ban was very intentional.
So it's again, a surprising campaign. I don't know what kind of effect it had, but certainly in Georgia, Warnock and Walker are going to a runoff. So at least he stemmed that tide to some degree. We'll see how the next month goes in that race. In Silicon Valley, I don't think it made any kind of dent, but certainly there are people talking about, okay, Asian American discrimination. We talked about the situation involving Harvard and the Supreme Court case, recently, and this is an ongoing issue, right? If you're a qualified Asian American student, you apply at Stanford, good luck, unless you've started a company when you're 16 or 17. And these are the challenges. There are kind of ceilings for a lot of Asian American students who have, on merit, should be getting all kines of opportunities. But
of course, there's the personality assessment, and they tend to always score low on that. And, Justice Alito called out the attorneys for Harvard recently and said, what's the metric? What's your standard? And Alito couldn't get a straight answer because, frankly, I think that whole personality assessment, shows the stereotype. The Asian Americans are quiet, don't have a personality, meek, not dynamic, won't lead, but they're all worker bees, right? And Harvard doesn't want a bunch of worker bees, even though on merit and grades, SAT scores, they're always elite.
Well, I mean, this is an ongoing battle. We're going to see how this election influences 2024. Let's move on beyond this election. And we didn't even talk about some of the other big victories.
Well, real quick, let me speak. We talked about this potential red wave, but here in my home state of Washington, it's still blue. And I think a lot of, folks in Seattle were, look, we know Seattle's Democrat. We know Seattle's liberal. And it's not a surprise. But I think a lot of folks who are running and backing Republican candidates who ran on public safety, the homeless crisis, right, were surprised that their candidates did not win election in office. And yet I've been working on a story. I want to go right to the video right now, showing this homeless crisis. That's my beat. But this past week, I uncovered a homeless encampment under a bridge here in the heart of Seattle. And this is a typical scene under the Washington State Department of Transportation property. You've got all of these encampments. The problem and the knock on the state agency is they're not moving fast enough. And they're just leaving these encampments here. And no doubt they're trying to get these homeless folks into housing. But in many cases, there just isn't enough housing, or the situation is that you have addicts here. You have drug addicts who want to do the drugs and just stay in place. So what's happening now in some of these cases is that you have the homeless at these encampments going into the neighborhoods beyond the encampment. They're squatting in houses. So that's become another issue here in Seattle. You have abandoned houses, yet with the colder months, and I don't blame the homeless, they want to go into warmer places, right? But a lot of times they find these abandoned houses and then other problems start, like fires, because they want to stay warm. They start fires, the whole house goes up, and then other houses in the neighborhood go up. So this is kind of an interesting situation. So you have the critics, especially a lot of the conservatives and Republicans, saying, hey, this is what Seattle gets. You could have voted in some Republican candidates, especially at the local level, but hey, you decided to leave it, and now look what's happening. You've got these homeless encampments that are not going anywhere, and some of the unintended consequences of these homeless encampments is that you have boarded up houses in these neighborhoods, and now you've got squatters going in. Is this happening in San Francisco? I mean, look at this hot mess.
To be frank, I'm sure there's some squatters in certain places, but the housing prices are, I think, almost, a third to maybe 50% higher in the Bay Area. So if there is an empty spot, that's rare, unless you're like in some of these Tony neighborhoods like Pebble Beach, where there's second or third homes and people have these empty homes with private security. But the reality is that this is a situation that I think all the public officials that we've spoken to in recent months are aware of. I actually had Manka Dhingra, who is a Washington State representative. She came on our election night special, and we got into this homeless crisis and brought up your reporting and brought up the fact that you're seeing this all on the ground and the impact. And she talked.
Is she following my stuff? Is she watching?
It's hard to say. I mean, you have to check your followers list to see if she's actually paying attention. But let's face it, I think there's no question that I think you've made an impact in the discourse. Now, it didn't show up politically because, against the polling, going back to like the midterms, the polling was all messed up. Remember, I mean, we thought the Republicans had a shot at potentially, at least making it competitive in the U.S. Senate race, but they got blown out of the water. And so I think, again, Washington residents, Seattle residents, they voted for a certain style of government, so that's what they're going to get.
Yeah, well, look, let's as we kind of wrap up this show, let's go to our final segment on Asian hate. Unfortunately, this is a reality that continues in this country. It wasn't a big issue when it came to this year's midterms. Nobody was talking about the rise of Asian hate, yet it's still happening. And there's an incident that happened just a few weeks ago in New York City, where a bunch of Indian American business owners and residents were being targeted by illegal immigrants from Colombia who were preying on these Indian Americans because they knew and assumed that many of them were affluent, wore jewelry, carried cash. That's the Indian American or Asian American or any immigrant experience.
Well, I should mention that this segment is sponsored by the California Public Library in the state of California, who wants us to emphasize all of these AAPI hate crimes that are going on, and that's why we're doing our best to showcase what's going on. And again, we've heard about these kind of wealthy immigrants, enclaves where you have folks that have cash or jewelry. I know in the Bay Area, the Chinese community was targeted. Certainly, the Indian community was targeted because a lot of Asian Americans do carry. They have, well-to-do situations, right? And so they carry gold and they leave that in their home at times. And so that's forced folks to reevaluate the security situation. So this was an unusual case out of New York where you have this group of thugs targeting Indian Americans who are unsuspecting. But again, this is these kind of crime rings are happening more and more and more. And again, it goes back to public safety. It goes back to a lot of these common denominator topics. I mean, you're talking about border security. This is what both the Democrats and the Republicans are running on. And I think this is where, come 2024, who's going to be able to articulate this message? And again, for an Asian American community, Asian Americans have by and large voted for Democrats. Are they feeling as if the Democrats are addressing these public safety issues? Because Asian Americans are doing pretty well by and large. And certainly Indian Americans are doing incredibly well. And that's why you're seeing, I think, more of a movement. Certainly, Indian Americans in 2020 voted overwhelmingly for President Biden. We don't know what the data is yet in 2022, but we'll get that data shortly. But certainly, I think the messaging behind public safety resonates, and I think this is where, going back to your DeSantis conversation, DeSantis, if he positions himself as kind of a hardline person on personal safety, I think he has a real opportunity to win that conversation and compel even more Asian Americans to the Republican Party.
Yeah, because the Democrats this year, again, as we even heard Kamala Harris say multiple times, the Democrats are trying to save the democracy and preserve or overturn, rather, the recent Supreme Court Roe v. Wade decision. They're all about bringing back pro-choice. So it's really interesting that the Democrats, at least publicly and nationally, ran on that. And again, basically stopped this red wave that was supposed to be coming. And a lot of the Republican candidates, they were running on public safety and, the inflation and high gas prices. And in some of these states that, had Republican candidates winning, it actually didn't happen. So I find that fascinating as well. And we'll see what happens as we get closer to, 2024. And of course, a lot of these, as you mentioned earlier, race is still up for grabs. And in Arizona, the governor's race, in Georgia, that's going to a runoff. So it's going to be really interesting in terms of the direction the House and the Senate goes.
And we shouldn't forget about the impact of young voters, right? So far, all the data indicates that the Gen Z group of voters overwhelmingly voted for the Democrats. And so that helps stem
And
the tide.
they came out. And what does that tell you? I think potentially the abortion issue was a big deal, because in many of these states, like Washington, where abortions are still legal, all of the Democratic politicians and leaders were pushing. It's all about abortion, giving women choice. So that resonated at least with Gen Z, apparently.
And I mean, we had this clip on earlier, but keep in mind, I mean, even someone like a Pramila Jayapal, your congresswoman there in Seattle, she did a TikTok video with Padma Lakshmi, the model turned food
chef, whatever she is. Yeah. Foodie.
Yeah. I mean, I never thought I'd see Pramila Jayapal and, dance around on a TikTok video, but I mean, maybe that's the way to appeal to a Gen Z audience. But Padma Lakshmi did that right before the election, and people are going to do whatever they can to get the attention span of young people. But I think it's pretty clear the abortion battle is something that people certainly voted for. They went out and turned out for that. And also, if you look at the numbers so far, I mean, Gen Z is overwhelmingly progressive, right? Very much in the Democratic camp. And so as older folks go towards a little bit more on the conservative side, that's getting counteracted by a bigger generation. Gen Z is a massive generation. And so,
right. And I still feel like some of these candidates backed by Trump, he was a liability to them. And I understand the cult of Trump is still alive and well, but I think there's a sea change happening right now, especially in the Republican Party. So again, fascinating dynamics. I think a lot of political commentators and watchers are going to be surprised again. And I like you said, I think it will be DeSantis, maybe Nikki Haley as the ticket, but I don't see Trump. I don't see Trump making it out this time around.
Well, I mean, again, I know he has a big base of support. I'm actually not going to write the guy off just because I've seen him just pull rabbits out all this time. But I mean, there's no question the deck has been stacked against him because he has all these legal challenges. He has other viable contenders, people that are resonating with a lot of folks in his base. So there's no question.
DeSantis, and so many Republicans I know, they don't want to deal with the PTSD again, right? A lot of the moderate Republicans, right? The independents who are up for grabs, right? They don't want to deal with Trump's PTSD. No doubt he got things done. No doubt he was right on China, okay? China being a massive threat right now. But the way he goes about handling himself, his messaging, and if you believe the reports, he was blaming Melania for recommending Dr. Oz as a candidate in Pennsylvania. I mean, if all of this stuff starts to leak again, and man, I don't know if I could go through another cycle like that. But the news media is going to love it if Trump runs, which he has not announced yet, and if he ends up winning this nomination, ends up in the White House again. Oh my gosh, another 4 years of insanity.
Well, you actually makes a very good point here in passing towards the end of this broadcast, because the news channels, they're all plummeting. Have you noticed? Look at the ratings.
The ratings.
And
yep.
I mean, Fox News has their core audience, but CNN is plummeting. MSNBC is faltering. All these channels, the guy that was propping up all of these cable news channels in particular was Trump.
The rage from the left. It was Donald Trump.
So with Trump kind of sidelined to some degree, I mean, numbers are down. And so we'll see if he becomes a boogeyman to the same degree that he was previously. But, come January 2023, and I should maybe mention this, the start of next year, campaign 2024 is on. Like election 2024, that campaign is starting in January. I mean, it might be starting literally in mid-November because Trump is likely to announce that he's running for president that quickly. But you're going to start seeing campaign ads. I've already been told by different operatives that they're going to start running ads in first quarter of next year. So This has now become like a 4-year, a minimum of 2 full year race. But it's more like kind of a 3 to 4 year race now.
And if Trump's in the fray, man, a lot of political watchers, even Joe Biden, alluding to the fact it's going to be interesting to see, the GOP tear themselves apart because it's going to be a civil war.
Absolutely. And so we're seeing all these dynamics. And one more dynamic I want to bring up before we go here: women voters. That's going to be a really interesting block to watch because we're seeing marriage rates decline. We're seeing less people actually giving birth to children. And so you have this rise of a professional class of women that are educated, single, or if they're married, they don't have children. And that's a different demographic, especially the professional women that are unmarried without children. That's a completely different demographic than, you say, 50 years ago or even 30 years ago. And so you have folks all over this country. Don't forget, women by far are getting more educated at all these universities, right? I think that it's like 60% women now. So you're going to see that group start to control not just metropolitan areas. They're going to have outsized influence on the way people vote and how things are shaped policy wise. And so the abortion debate, that was just the first flashpoint. If you do anything else, women are going to come out to vote and make their voice heard. And so that's going to also be a counter to folks that are raising children and having families. And there's a different dichotomy here. I mean, I've had discussions while here in New York about this dynamic, because you see that in a place like New York. You have a lot of single professional women in a place like New York City, and you're seeing the politics behind that. But you're starting to see that all over this country. So that's another interesting demo to watch. Gen Z and professional women. That's to me, in 2024, they're going to have a big say in how things go.
I've got nothing else to add, man.
Well, as always, and I want to thank all the folks. We have this phenomenal 3-hour show from coast to coast. You can watch the thing in its entirety on our YouTube channel, on Diya TV's YouTube channel. But Shri Thanadar, big story, because now that he is in office, it's going to change the dynamic. It's called the Samosa Caucus, informally nicknamed by Raja Krishnamurthy. Now 5 Indian Americans there. And we still have more voting and more tabulations to count, like Southern California, very contentious race involving a couple of Asian American candidates. So we're going to see a different House. And is the GOP going to hold on? Because we thought they had a lock on the House, and they may not. And that's something to watch out for.
Yeah, something to watch out for, again, that we're going to be hearing and talking about on this show, again, is the Asian American voting bloc, especially Indian Americans, and how much they're going to be in play, and also how much they're going to be courted. We're going to see that.
Oh, we're going to see that in a major way moving forward. All right, for Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. Thanks for joining us here on this edition of Protected Speech. We'll see you again next time.